All right, so today we're diving deep, really deep into the life of David Barksdale.
A name that's pretty much synonymous with Chicago gang history, you could say.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you can't really talk about one without the other, can you? And we're going right to the source with this one, using an excerpt from his Wikipedia page.
Which always comes with its own set of caveats, right?
Oh, absolutely. Especially with a figure like Barksdale, there's going to be, well, let's just say there are a few issues flagged on this particular page.
Oh, that's right. Issues.
Makes you wonder what we're going to find, doesn't it? So where do we even begin with a guy like David Barksdale? Well, the story starts down south, Mississippi to be exact. Denise David Barksdale, born into a family of, get this, 13 children.
Wow, 13 kids. That's a full house.
Yeah, no kidding. But the family didn't stay in Mississippi. They packed up and moved to Chicago in 57.
57, huh? That's a big change, going from rural Mississippi to the heart of Chicago, especially back then.
Huge, right? Chicago was a whole different world. The city was booming, lots of industrial growth, but also a ton of social tension brewing under the surface.
Yeah, I can see how that kind of environment could create a breeding ground for, well, for figures like Barksdale.
And rise he did. Here's the thing. Just 3 years after arriving in Chicago at the age of 15,
15.
Barksdale was already known as a gang leader. 15 years old.
That's incredible. I mean, what do you think it was about him, or maybe about that time period, that allowed someone that young to rise up so fast in that world?
It's a good question, right? It's like, what makes someone a leader in that kind of environment? He must have had some serious charisma or maybe a knack for, I don't know, strategy.
Yeah, maybe a bit of both. But you also got to remember the social context. Back in those neighborhoods, there wasn't a lot of, traditional support systems. So gangs, they offered a sense of belonging, a kind of twisted sense of community.
It's like they filled a void in a way.
Right, exactly.
Huh?
Especially for young people who felt like they were being ignored or left behind,
Yeah, I get that. So fast forward a few years to 1966. Barksdale's gang, they'd been absorbing all these smaller groups. And by then they were known as, get this, the Black Disciple Nation.
Nation, huh? That's a pretty bold statement.
It was more than just a gang at that point. It was an organization with structure, hierarchy, almost like a, I don't know, like a paramilitary group or something.
Yeah, it's a different level of organization,
Yeah.
And with that came more power, more control, more influence in those neighborhoods.
Or money, too, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. It wasn't just about turf wars anymore.
Yeah.
These gangs, they were running businesses, protection rackets, getting involved in drug trafficking. The stakes were much higher.
And, of course, that meant more violence, and there was a lot of it, especially with rival gangs like the Blackstone Rangers. But then, here's where things get interesting. Barksdale, despite being right in the middle of all this, he starts talking about peace.
Really? Peace?
Yeah. He actually proposes a merger in 1973 with Larry Hoover, the leader of the Supreme Gangsters.
Wow. That's a pretty unexpected move coming from a guy known for leading a powerful and, let's be honest, sometimes violent organization.
Yeah, it's like, is this a genuine desire for peace, or is it some kind of strategic power play? What do you think?
It's hard to say for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe he saw the damage that all the fighting was doing to his community. Maybe he was looking for a way out. Or maybe he saw it as a way to consolidate power, create an even bigger, more dominant force.
It could be a little of both, right? The idealist and the pragmatist all rolled into one.
Yeah, maybe. But regardless of his motivations, the merger did happen. They formed the Black Gangster Disciple Nation, a whole new chapter.
And that brings us back to Barksdale, the individual, because there's this one detail in the Wikipedia article that really jumped out at me. It says he was arrested 25 times.
25 times?
But never convicted of a serious offense.
Wow, that's pretty remarkable for a guy in his position. How do you explain that?
I don't know, maybe he was just incredibly good at working the system, or maybe he had connections, people on the inside looking out for him.
Yeah, or maybe he was just lucky. Who knows?
Or maybe he was playing a different game altogether. The article also mentions that he used an alias, David Jones.
An alias.
Interesting. It makes you wonder, was he trying to fly under the radar, create a separate identity, or maybe even distance himself from the increasingly dangerous world he was a part of?
Yeah, it adds another layer to the whole mystery, doesn't it? Like, Who was the real David Barksdale? Was he the feared gang leader, the peacemaker, the savvy operator? Or was it all just a carefully constructed facade?
It's easy to get lost in all the talk of gangs and power struggles, but we got to remember, we're talking about a real person here, a guy with a family, with a life outside of all that.
Yeah, that's right. And actually, the Wikipedia excerpt, it mentions his wife, Yvonne Yarber,
Oh, yeah.
and their 3 kids.
Huh. So they had a family. I wonder what that was like for them, living with, everything that came with Barksdale's lifestyle.
Well, it definitely wasn't easy. One of their sons, he was actually killed in '96 by a member of the Gangster Disciples.
Oh, wow. The Gangster Disciples, that's the group Barksdale helped create when he merged with Larry Hoover.
Yeah, exactly. It's like even when you try to escape the violence, it can still come back to haunt you.
That's heavy. And what about Yvonne? What happened to her?
Well, sadly, she was murdered too, just a few years after Barksdale died.
It's like their family was trapped in this cycle of violence that they just couldn't break free from.
Yeah, it really makes you think about the lasting impact of those choices, how they can ripple outward and affect generations.
It's a tragic story for sure. When we were talking about those issues flagged on the Wikipedia page, one thing that really caught my eye was the account of the assassination attempt on Barksdale back in 1970.
Yeah. What about it?
Well, it's just so incredibly detailed. Like, it mentions the attackers were armed with M14 rifles, even gives the exact address of the bar where it happened.
I mean, that does sound pretty specific.
It's almost like too specific, Makes me wonder if it's all completely accurate or if some of it's been, I don't know, embellished over time.
Yeah, you always have to be careful with these kinds of accounts,
Yeah.
especially when they rely on memories, which can fade or get distorted over the years.
So how do we even know what to believe? I mean, how do we separate fact from fiction when it comes to a guy like Barksdale? It's like we're trying to solve a puzzle, but some of the pieces are missing.
That's the challenge, isn't it? We have to look for corroborating evidence. Try to cross-reference different sources, see if the details line up.
Like police reports, newspaper articles, that sort of thing.
Exactly. And even then, there might be gaps in the information, conflicting accounts, biases we need to be aware of.
It's like playing detective, right? Trying to piece together the truth from all these scattered fragments.
That's a good way to put it. And even with all that effort, we might never have the complete picture. But the process of searching, that's what's important.
It's about the journey, huh?
Exactly. It's about asking questions, being critical, and always being open to new information that might challenge our assumptions.
Thinking about Barksdale's story, it's hard not to see it as a product of its time. You know what I mean? Like what was happening in Chicago back then, socially and politically, that might have contributed to his rise and to the rise of gang activity in general.
We have to remember, Chicago in the 60s and 70s, it was a city in transition. Lots of racial tension, poverty, inequality.
So those conditions kind of created this perfect storm for gangs to take root.
Yeah, exactly. For a lot of young people, especially in Black communities, gangs offered a sense of belonging, a way to make money, a way to exert power in a world that felt stacked against them.
It's like they provided a twisted sense of opportunity that wasn't available through traditional channels.
Right. And Barksdale, with his charisma, his leadership skills, he was able to tap into that, to create a structure, an organization that gave those young people a sense of purpose, even if that purpose was ultimately destructive.
So he was both a product of his environment and a shaper of it. It's like it all kind of feeds back into itself, this cycle of poverty, violence, and despair.
Yeah, it's a complex web of factors.
Yeah.
And Barksdale's story, it reflects that complexity. It's a reminder that historical figures, even the ones who did bad things, they weren't operating in a vacuum. They were influenced by the world around them.
That's a really good point. It's not about excusing their actions, but it's about understanding the context, the forces that shaped them. And that brings us to the question of legacy. You mentioned earlier that the Black Disciples still celebrate Barksdale's birthday, right?
Yeah, they do. Every year. It's a big event for them.
But how do we reconcile that with the fact that he was a criminal? I mean, some people see him as a hero, a community leader, while others see him as a villain, a symbol of violence and destruction.
It's a tough question, isn't it?
Yeah.
How do you deal with a legacy that's so complicated, so full of contradictions?
Yeah, it's a real head scratcher, right? How do you make sense of a guy who is both a leader and, let's be real, involved in some pretty serious criminal activity?
It's a tough one, for sure.
I mean, it's not about saying what he did was okay, but trying to understand, the whole picture, the choices people make when they're in that world.
It's about nuance, right? You can acknowledge the damage that gang violence causes, the lives lost, the communities torn apart. But you also have to recognize that these stories are never simple.
Like we were saying before, it's those shades of gray.
Exactly.
Barksdale might have been involved in crime, but he also wanted peace. He tried to find common ground between these rival gangs. And don't forget, he had a family, he was a part of this community. It's all got to be considered.
And I think those contradictions, that's what makes these historical figures so interesting, you know? It reminds us that people aren't just one thing. They're capable of both good and bad.
So how do we approach these legacies then? Do we focus on the negative, the harm that was done? Or do we try to find those moments of hope, those times when someone tried to make things better, even if they didn't completely succeed?
I think it's about seeing the whole person, the good and the bad, the successes and the failures, getting the full context, understanding the social forces at play, the choices they made, and what happened because of those choices.
It's about remembering that these figures were human beings, not just characters in some story. They were shaped by their circumstances, by the time they lived in cities.
Exactly. And I think that understanding can help us grapple with these bigger issues, things like poverty, inequality, the systems that keep these cycles of violence going.
It's about finding ways to break those cycles, right?
Right.
To build a world where everyone has a fair shot.
Absolutely. That's the goal.
So Barksdale's life, even though it ended tragically, I think it can be a lesson for us, a warning about the dangers of unchecked ambition, the terrible consequences of violence, but also a reminder that there's always hope for change, this desire for something better.
Yeah, even in the darkest parts of history, there are lessons to be learned, opportunities to grow, and to understand things better.
And those lessons are so relevant today. We're still struggling with a lot of the same problems: poverty, inequality, violence.
Yeah, it's like we haven't fully learned from the past.
What do you think Barksdale's story can teach us about dealing with these challenges now, in the present?
I think it shows how important it is to fix the things that cause these problems in the first place. We got to invest in communities, create opportunities for young people, give them a real alternative to gang life.
Yeah, it can't just be about punishment. It's got to be about prevention, too, right? Addressing the root causes of violence instead of just reacting to it after it happens.
Absolutely. Things like education, job training, mental health services, and programs that bring communities together, that give people a sense of hope and belonging.
It's about creating a world where kids don't feel like they have to join a gang to find those things.
That's the dream, right?
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the life of David Barksdale, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this? What can we learn from this complicated and, let's be honest, pretty disturbing story?
I think it forces us to really examine how we view the past, to understand that people are complex, and even in the darkest parts of our history, there are things we can learn from, opportunities to become better.
It's a call to action, right? It's a reminder that we have to learn from what's happened before, to work towards a future that's fairer and more just, to break these cycles of violence that have gone on for far too long.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, thanks for joining us on this journey through the life and times of David Barksdale. Hopefully it's given you some things to think about, maybe even inspired you to do something to make a difference. Until next time, keep digging deeper, keep asking questions, and keep trying to understand this crazy world we live in.